Right. So, hi and welcome everyone. So excited to have you here for Essential Skills Live with our exciting guest, Nicole. So, this particular session is part of a series that I started. If you don't know who I am, my name is Heather Whiteman. I like to refer to myself as a people data enthusiast because I have just been doing people data stuff for a very long time, from consulting, different forms of analytics, data applications, doing people analytics within the corporate setting, and now being a professor of people analytics. And I just love sharing knowledge around this space. So that's what this whole series is all about. Over the course of my time, I get asked a lot for advice about careers. And on accident, all of that advice kept getting written down until it turned into a book. I never meant to write this book, but I somehow ended up with about 400 pages of career advice, something that I had been given out to individuals when they would ask, something I would provide to my students. And then when we started the new Society for People Analytics, which I am the vice president for currently, we started to say, how do we build up this community in a way where we can invite people to share knowledge and skills and really build community? And let's keep it nonprofit. And so I decided to put this book up for sale as a way to build up some funds for us to do things like support our web pages and put things out to the community. So thank you for everyone who purchased a copy. Your sales do go to the Society for People Analytics. So thank you for your donation. And then also as a thank you, I wanted to start up this series because the whole book says, get these skills, get these skills, get these skills. So I wanted to help you get some skills. So these sessions are a mix of showing you some amazing people analytics leaders who can share their career journey, but then also actually teach a skill. So I have asked our wonderful guest to come to first share a little bit about the background, but then actually do a little teaching moment. So I will be putting our guests on the spot to actually teach you a new skill or topic in some kind of depth, but in the challenging format of a very quick little bite. So that will be our plan. After that, we will go into more fun community building time so that we can connect with others who want to learn and share. That part will be private. We'll close that off so that you can have deep, meaningful conversations with others, and that will be how we go through this agenda. So I want to, sorry, my slides just moved around here. I want to introduce the wonderful Nicole Lettich. Thank you so much for being on here. Nicole has shared career advice in other times and just really impressed and amazed me with not just her own career, but the way that she goes about framing it, some of her approaches to your own particular career mapping process, the way you share insights with others. But then what I really love about you is you have this depth, this technical depth that you mix with your leadership and with your strategy. And so I'd really appreciate to understand a little bit about you. And so my first question is, who are you? Please introduce yourself and ideally give us that kind of story. How did you end up where you are in people analytics?
Well, thank you so much for having me here, Heather. I really appreciate the opportunity to share my background. I would say that I've been very fortunate to have had a really varied career. So early in my career, I worked in marketing analytics and product marketing, product management. And so that really instilled in me the importance of measurement. So as you know, marketing is all about looking at cost of acquisition, measuring lift. And on the product side, I was able to understand how to drive those go-to-market strategies, think about customer value propositions, and also how to really communicate well when it comes to explaining why customers should buy our product. What made it so important to them? What problem was it solving? And after doing that for some years, I decided that I wanted to build something of my own. So I decided to pursue entrepreneurship, and I owned and operated different small businesses for about 8 years. And when I tell you that was the best experience that I could have had, it was really a boot camp in everything end to end and running that business. So I had to understand the finance aspects, the operations, staffing, purchasing, and of course, problem solving. However, I will say that it was exhausting. And, I got to a point where I knew that I wanted to narrow my scope. And I decided to just take a step back and reflect and think about what it is that I value and where I could add value. And at that point, I decided to actually take a role as a management accountant. So, as you can tell from this story, it took me, my journey into people analytics and into HR was very winding. Um, but I was working as a management accountant for a small but growing real estate development and property management company. And my role there was again more the data side. So looking at cost containment, looking at expenses, overseeing payroll, finding areas where we could streamline operations. And after I was there for a few months, one of the owners approached me and said, do you want to be the HR person? We're growing. We haven't had a dedicated person. My initial thought was, no. I just kind of went through this reflection, thought about where I wanted to be, and HR was definitely not on the roadmap. But I actually paused. I said, give me some time to think about it. And I actually realized there wasn't someone there who had done it before. So this was complete white space. So I actually had the opportunity to take on a role in a way that honored me and what I valued, but then to also support my manager. So I ended up building up this HR function. In a way, it really made sense. I was already looking at expenses. So now I was able to see how the HR policies and processes could help influence that. So I implemented an HRIS system. So that was a cost savings right there. I was able to switch our staff that worked out in the field from manual time cards to mobile time cards. That was a big help with actually controlling overtime costs. And then it also improved the experience for the staff in the office who every week had to try to decipher illegible time cards, which was not fun for anyone. So that was a big win right there. And in that role, I was also able to look at things like our benefits offerings. So, could we expand them in a way that would actually help with our employee retention and do it in a way that was relatively cost neutral? And because I was able to connect those dots in that role, it felt like people analytics. I didn't know that it was called people analytics at the time, but I knew that I was really engaged in this work and that I wanted to do more of it. So I did some research. I was like, oh, this is a thing. I want to pursue it. So I ended up leaving that role where I was managing a small team, and I found a role where I could step into a dedicated individual contributor role in people analytics. And then that was really the inflection point for me in my career that led me here.
That that's awesome. And I do see so many of that accidental career path, which is it's fun though. And by the way, you're getting a couple heart reactions there in the chat. But I think the other thing that I notice is people sometimes accidentally end up here and then they never leave. They love it. It connects. There's so much good parts there. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, so my next question for you. Again, the book is like, this skill is important, this skill is important, this skill is important. In fact, sometimes it can be overwhelming because it's, in a way, a skills inventory. So, from your perspective, really quick version, what are the 2 to 3 most essential skills for people analytics in your opinion?
Yes, I think that's a great question. So I would say one of the skills, and I believe it's something that you can learn that served me well throughout my career is resiliency. So, especially in people analytics, it's a leading edge field. You're going to come up with a lot of ideas. People aren't always going to say yes. Sometimes it's the wrong time. Sometimes there's not budget, but you have to be willing to continue to push things forward and figure out a way to do that.
I like that one. Yeah, resiliency and in these days when there's so much ambiguity, you kind of
Yeah.
have to have this extra strength and connection there. That's great.
Absolutely. And then I would say another skill that I think is really important is that qualitative piece. So I think, it's people analytics, so we know that we need to have the quantitative piece, but that qualitative piece. So asking the right questions, being able to figure out what's important to people so that way you can know where to focus your attention. Or when you're bringing insights to people, what's going to spark that interest in them as well.
Yeah, I'm all about that. We can't be explained by numbers alone. Numbers are incredibly useful, but there's also this whole other qualitative side. And to be a people analytics professional, you have to be wanting to play both sides. That's awesome. Okay, so I pressured you into give us something technical. And so for those of you joining, I wanted our experts to give you a new skill, teach you something maybe you don't spend a lot of time in. And I was like, something really unique that maybe we don't talk about often. And Nicole had tons of really good ideas, but there was one that I was like, I have never heard anyone really talk about that in one of these sessions. And so I'm excited by this topic of effect size. If you do not know what an effect size is, awesome, because this is all about learning. If you do, you're still going to be kind of excited because maybe you haven't thought about it in all the different applications and all the different ways. So, Nicole, do you mind giving us a little bit of example of how we use effect sizes, how they're important, what this really means to people analytics?
Absolutely. And I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. All right. So, what I wanted to show you is a typical result that you might present. Let's say you have a stakeholder that approaches you and says, "Oh, I noticed that in country C, attrition is 6%, but it's 3% in country B. Can you do a deep dive analysis to explain what's happening here?" So you go out, you get your data, you speak to your people partners and other stakeholders within the organization to understand what's going on. You put together a clear story that is explaining what could be driving those differences. You then go and say, I'm going to do a statistical analysis. And look, this p-value is less than zero point 0.5. Nailed it. However, you also need to consider the effect size. So p-values will tell you that there is a difference, but effect sizes will tell you how big that difference is. And so with this specific data, yes, there is a statistically significant difference, but that association is really weak. So we can't really say that country and attrition are really connected. It's probably not the driver. So when you think about the way this, language is framed and it's presented, it's like, oh my gosh, it's very dramatic. So this really shows why effect size is important because if you know that there's a weak association, you'd probably tone down the language. So I want to talk a bit about why you need to really pay attention to effect size. So if you kind of ignore it, that's one of those like gotchas, right? So p-value is only going to tell you whether or not something's due to chance. It's not going to tell you how meaningful that difference is. So p-value, is there a difference? Effect size, how big is the difference? And that how big is the difference is key because that's going to tell you whether or not you need to take action. P-values, you need them. They're going to explain to you whether or not that null hypothesis is true. But effect size is all about the practicality of that difference. So if it's statistically significant, but only two or three people are impacted, and it's not to say, again, it's people analytics, right? So every person's experience is important, but are we going to change our retention practices for two or three people? So that's where that practical significance comes into play. And another thing that's important to understand is with p-values, very sensitive to sample size. So when you're looking at bigger group, it's going to pick up more of that noise, but effect sizes, they don't have the same issue. They're less sensitive. So I wanted to just say, okay, now that we know a bit about effect size, how could you have approached this analysis instead? So one thing that you could do is we'll keep our chart on the left because that's going to show us the differences, the difference in the rates. It's going to show you the differences or the size of the countries there. But on the right, you can use something called the expected ranges, which basically shows you for countries of this size, we would expect to have between 36 and 57 employees leave. And if you look at country A, okay, they're right within that range. If you look at country B, they're really only slightly better. So they had 30 people leave, which is just a little bit better than the 36 that was at the lower end. And then if you look at country C, which, if we look at B versus C, it's double the attrition. But in reality, only three more people left, outside of that expected range. So if I had to do this again, knowing what the effect size is, number one, I would tone down the language. And I would also provide this additional visual so that my stakeholders have some comfort in knowing that, yeah, we can look at these rates and see that there are some differences, but we're not talking about a lot of people here, so we don't need to change our retention strategy. So since this is just a quick bite, the effect size that I used there was Kramer's V. So that's something that you would use with categorical data. So if you're looking at contingency tables, so just a tabular, table that has country on one side and attrition status across the top, then you could use that. And you'll use that for tables that are bigger than 2 by 2. So there I had three countries, and then it would be people who were still active versus people who exited. If I had a small table, a 2 by 2, I could use something called phi. And then if you were looking at difference in means, you would use Cohen's d, you would use eta squared for variance in ANOVA, and then odds or risk ratios if you're using binary outcomes. So if you've done logistic regression, you are familiar with those odds ratios. So again, it's just also important to understand which effect size you should use in which instance. So that's my bit on effect size.
This is awesome. So, I want to position what you just taught us in a different way. Yes, you taught us effect size, but you also taught us myth busting. Meaning sometimes you can have very real, very true data. Like your first chart was actual data and it was good statistics, even checking the p-value, but it was sending the wrong message. Like it was, hey, don't overreact. And so the effect size helps to really put it into context, put it into size, put it into impact, and really connect it back to, is there a business benefit in going after this? So I really appreciate it from that, because sometimes we can react to charts without taking into account the context. So I love how that's connected. Um, so at this point, we'll open it up to some questions. I think we have some questions about your first part, which we'll do that second, because we're still mentally on effect size. And does anyone have any questions for Nicole about effect size?
I do. Sorry. Hi, I'm Tanya. When I think about a lot of the questions that necessarily have come to me when I've been doing some analytics in the people team, it's normally coming from like people are understand that there will be attrition, but it'll be like, oh, like these two or three people left, and that's when they start getting riled up. And so, how can you like manage both using like effect size, and thinking about like comparisons while you are still trying to, because we aren't all just numbers. Like, if me and someone else is hired, if one of us is gone, it's going to have a different impact on, the reality of people's experience. So how do you kind of manage through that? Because it's like for certain people, you might need to make changes if you start losing all your leaders or something.
No, that's a great question. And I think what I tend to do is rely on qualitative data there. Because two or three people, it's going to be so hard to pick up that trend just in the numbers and to even speak to what impact that will have. And I think you raised a very good example where it's like two or three leaders left. And we know that there's turnover contagion. So that might mean that some of their close direct reports might leave. So it's not to say that it's not important, but I think that's where you have to lean into the qualitative and not just on the numbers and use that as part of your slides or part of your presentation.
That makes total sense. Like it has to be married, or it's like people are gonna be like, "You're just treating us all like numbers." And it's like that's not what we're doing either. Like
Exactly.
you're like, two things can be true. Calm down.
Exactly.
Fair.
Other questions on effect size?
Also, is there anywhere where like everyone's country, like the population is so large that you could really compare that much? Like that seems crazy. I'm like, oh, I guess at like a large company it would make
Right.
sense. But I was just like, whoa, 1,000 people in like four different countries. Like, okay.
Yeah, and then I mean, and you can pick really anything, right? So it could be any sort of demographic, it could be career family, it could be,
Mm.
yeah.
That makes sense.
So, Nicole, you do have a question asking for your approach. How would you explain statistical significance to stakeholders in a simple, not confusing way when they're starting to question your stat methodology?
Yes. So depending on their comfort level with stats, I may not even use the term statistical significance at all. So what I tend to do is I tend to rely on visualizations. So I'm a, big proponent of using things like those confidence interval charts because it's easy to see, oh, this dot is out of bounds. That is kind of out of an expected range. Or you could say something like, this is unusual. But I think sometimes when we use the term statistical significance, it gets a little bit watered down. I think sometimes people tend to overuse it. So I tend to rely on more of the qualitative piece, especially when people aren't really data people.
Yeah, I love that. And I know I like to just talk, I tend to use the term natural fluctuation. I know that sounds a little over the top, but also people tend to be like, oh yeah, there is like kind of a natural
Hmm.
like flow of things. And so I tend to say like due to chance or natural fluctuation as well.
Exactly. Yeah, I think
Mhm.
it's much more palatable if it's just in language that people are used to hearing all of the time.
Yeah, awesome. Great. Another question is, what would you consider to be too small of an effect size in an HR context?
So it depends. So I have several rules of thumb that I use, and it depends on your data. So let's say, for example, I'm looking at a very large table that's maybe like 6 by 5, then the effect size is going to be larger than if it's a very small table. So what I could do is, because I saw someone in the chat ask if I could share out the slides. So what I could do is I could share the slide with some of the rules of thumb that I use to determine whether or not that effect size is meaningful.
That's awesome. Thank you for that. Other questions on effect size? Yeah, Sheena.
Hi there. Thanks for your response earlier. A follow-up question. I know you were explaining how you use qualitative data. Can you provide a bit more details how you would use qualitative data to explain your statistical results?
Yes, so that's one of the interesting things about sitting in a people analytics role is that you don't always have direct access to employees. So what I tend to do is I partner with HRBPs or our people partners to understand what's happening within their organization. So let's say, for example, that I'm seeing that attrition is, spiking or there are differences within a specific group. I would sit down with them and have a conversation and ask, did something change? Right? And they might come back and say, kind of building off of Tanya's comments earlier, oh, yes, a leader left and some of these people weren't happy. Or, oh, there was, people are being asked to return to office and, they don't love it. So that information is actually really important because there's a lot of data about people's experiences that we just don't have, especially when we're talking about smaller groups or 2 or 3 people. So I would work with them to get that additional context and then literally put those verbatims into a slide deck. So it becomes, again, more of a partnership when I'm producing that information.
Okay, gotcha. It's like a marrying quantitative, qualitative data to provide the full picture too and help better explain some of the results. Okay, thank
Exactly.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of tossing some qualitative literally onto your visual, just like you were saying, Nicole. If you happen to, have exit interviews and you're showing that country graph and somebody mentions that the work setup in their location is less than ideal in their exit interview, you pop that quote right onto that chart to explain the kind of country or location-based difference. That's a really
Yeah. And I think that's also really powerful too. And it gets down to that when we're doing statistical analysis, we're looking at that big group. But if you pull that qualitative in, where someone's saying it's like their work setup is bad, you can actually fix that, right? So that's like giving you something tangible that you can influence. And even though it may not be affecting a large number of people, I bet if it was, resolved, people would be thrilled. So.
Any other effect size questions? Okay, there was a question earlier and it tied back to your comment about resilience. So I think this would be a fantastic question to get your input on. Is how do you keep true to that? How do you keep your resilience when you're up against resistance?
I think at this point, it's just something that I've built up over time. So part of what I've had to do is not internalize things. So what is the reason that someone's being resistant? Can I find that out? Don't just take a no and say like, okay, I'm just going to give up. It's just like figure out why. Sometimes it's something that's out of their control. I've literally had many instances where I've presented something and I was like, I think we should do this. I think it's a great idea, but the timing may not be right. So sometimes you may just be a bit, in a different place than where your stakeholders are, where even if they wanted to, they couldn't action it. So it's not that what you're doing is wrong or your idea isn't good. Sometimes you just have to take a look at the bigger picture of what's happening and then figure out why things aren't moving forward. Um, the other thing that I've also found is that it pays to be reflective, right? So, is there something that you could have done differently when it comes to approach? There's also a lot of change management involved in people analytics. So if you're trying to go from A to Z and people are kind of stuck on B, you have to really figure out, well, maybe I need to go a few steps back and get buy-in before trying to jump ahead. So it's a slow process. And I feel like that's something within the field, we see a lot of success stories. People are doing a lot of great work. We don't always see sort of the work that went into it, right? So I think we have to be really pragmatic about what's possible in our roles and be really, like something that I do every year. I look back every year, myself and with my team, and I look at where we were in January and I look at where we ended up in December. Because I think sometimes when we're in it, we don't realize how far we've come. And I think just taking that approach makes you realize, like, oh, I did some stuff, right? May not feel like it, like, because I was kind of like in the thick of it, but I moved the needle from, A to B. Maybe we're not in C, but I took those initial steps. And I think it's really important for us to totally normalize that. Like everything is just like, we're not going to shoot out of the cannon and leap ahead. There's some work that you have to put in, and sometimes it can be a slog, but you have to respect the fact that you are progressing and don't diminish the steps that you take.
That's awesome. And you're getting a comment that there's people like the team reflection practice and they want around there. Something I would add for people on that the resistance part is sometimes you don't know that you actually might be planting seeds even when you get a no. And unfortunately, it's not something you'll ever discover until way later. But sometimes you have an idea, and like Nicole's saying, it's not the right time, but you actually planted it in someone's brain and they told you no then. But I sometimes 2 years go by and they're like, wait, didn't you? Now we can't hold out for that, but just know that it's the resistance isn't always about the idea or you. It's like the timing, and you might be planting seeds for a really cool opportunity later.
Yeah, and then, and you just made me think there's an expression in sales where sometimes it's like if you're not getting the right answer, you're either not asking the right questions or the right people. And so I think that's also something with that resilience. It's like no doesn't always mean no. It could just mean like maybe this is like somebody else who can champion this, right? Or maybe there's a different use case. So again, that's where I think that reflection is important. So if it's something that you're really committed to making happen, don't you have to, figure out ways to see it through.
Any last questions for Nicole?
That was just really well said. That was all I wanted to include. I was like, it's fair. We all know people come to us with things, and then we're like, that'd be a great idea if I wasn't already drowning in 17 other things. And then, like, maybe when you get a little air, you're like, oh, yeah.
Okay. Well, then at this part, we are about to transition into our second part of this. So at this point, we will stop sharing this publicly, but I want to thank you so much, Nicole. Such great insights. I love that you tackled everything from resilience to effect size and how to explain p-values. I mean, I feel like we got the full spectrum in a short period of time. So really, really appreciate you. Thank you for all of that. We will break into our private session now where we can all connect, build community, and talk. These are for the individuals who purchased a copy of the book. Also for everyone who's watching this on the recording, we'll have another one of these in the future. Our next guest will be Richard Rose now. And so for everyone on, hopefully you'll come back and we'll have another one of these here in the future. And for everyone who's watching on the recording or the live, bye. We'll see you later. For everyone else, let's connect, let's talk, and we will break out into some community building.